The North Atlantic, winter 1943. The sea looked calm enough to deceive a rookie. Flat pewter water under a thin white sky. But the men on watch knew calm was never trust. Beneath that stillness moved something older and hungrier than weather. The hum of diesel engines gliding in silence. The search of metal for metal. From the bridge of a small gray ship, an officer studied the horizon through frozen binoculars. Nothing. Only spray, wind, and the faint glint of convoy lights 3 miles off. Yet in the sonar room below, a single pulse returned. A heartbeat where none should be. The operator swallowed, adjusted his gain, and called up the line. Within moments, men ran to stations, the calm surface breaking apart as throttles advanced. Somewhere in the darkness, an enemy crew listened to the same sea, waiting for its answer. Tonight, the smallest ships in the fleet would learn to hunt. Before the destroyer Escorts earned their nickname, they were an argument welded into steel. In 1941, the Atlantic had become an underwater graveyard. Merchant convoys leaving New York or Halifax vanished mid-journey. Ships carrying wheat, oil, and ammunition sank without a trace, taking entire crews down with them. The Royal Navy's destroyers were stretched thin, guarding fleets, ports, and troop convoys all at once. America's entry into the war only deepened the crisis. There were too many hulls to protect, and not enough guardians to stand watch. Out of this arithmetic of loss came a new concept: a smaller, cheaper destroyer built not for speed or prestige, but for endurance and numbers. A ship that could be produced in dozens, even hundreds, without breaking the industrial rhythm of war. The first plans arrived at the Navy's Bureau of Ships in Washington in early 1942. Engineers studied what could be trimmed away. Fewer guns, smaller engines, reduced range. What could not be sacrificed was stamina. The ability to stay at sea for 2 weeks or more, rolling through storms, chasing sonar echoes, and towing damaged freighters. The resulting blueprints looked modest beside the heavy destroyers already in service, but each line on the paper represented a decision between survival and efficiency. In wartime, even simplicity is a form of genius. Shipyards in Massachusetts, California, and New Jersey became the forges of this idea. Skilled hands were scarce, so the work shifted to assembly line precision. Hull sections arrived by train. Turbines came pre-tested from inland plants. Welders, many of them women, learned to fuse steel plates under floodlights that turned night into a second shift. Each completed section rolled forward like a promise. In some yards, the time between keel laying and launch fell to less than 2 months. The destroyer Escort was not one vessel, but a method. Speed through repetition, quality through pattern. To the men who would crew them, these ships felt unfamiliar. They were smaller, their decks closer to the water, their mess halls cramped. Yet they carried a presence that belied their size. Each one bore sonar equipment, radar, anti-submarine mortars, and racks of depth charges, tools of a new kind of warfare fought by sound and patience. In a destroyer Escort, technology became the equalizer. A well-trained sonar operator could wield as much power as a gun crew on a battleship. At first, the Navy brass viewed the program with skepticism. Traditional destroyers could reach over 30 knots. These new ships barely managed 24. Critics warned that a slower Escort would never catch a submarine once it attacked. The rebuttal came from numbers. There would simply be more of them. One destroyer Escort might not outrun a U-boat, but 10 working in formation could deny it space to breathe. The strategy mirrored the Liberty ship philosophy. Mass, not magnificence, would win the Atlantic. By the time the first ships were commissioned, Buckley-class, Cannon-class, Edsall-class, the convoys had begun to feel their absence turning into presence. Sailors joked that the Escorts were half a ship with twice the work, but respect grew quickly. On their first crossings, they weathered gales that scattered heavier vessels. Their hulls flexed but held. Their sonar kept ringing. Every safe arrival proved the design's worth. The Atlantic acknowledged none of it. Fog smothered light, ice formed on railings, and waves shattered against steel like artillery. In those conditions, the Escort's compact size became advantage. They could turn faster, recover from rolls that would cripple a larger ship, and slip between convoy lanes like shepherd dogs among cattle. Beneath decks, diesel generators hummed a steady rhythm. The sound was oddly comforting. It meant heat, electricity, and life. What made them steel wolves was not aggression, but instinct. Each new contact on the sonar scope was treated as prey, each maneuver a pattern refined through practice. Crews learned to read the sea the way hunters read wind. If the echo shifted tone, the submarine had changed depth. If it faded, temperature layers were bending the sound. They logged everything, shared it, improved together. By late 1943, destroyer escorts were no longer experiments. They were doctrine afloat. Industry had created them, but endurance made them legend. Each hull carried the fingerprints of thousands who never saw the ocean. Riveters from Cleveland, machinists from Kansas, draftsmen who worked from dawn to blackout. When the ships left port, the factories dimmed slightly, as if a pulse had moved outward across the country. And on the first night at sea, when the convoy settled into rhythm, the crews understood they were part of something larger than steel. In 10 minutes of combat, they might justify 1,000 hours of labor. That was the wager the nation had made. They first heard it through the hull, a faint, rhythmic tapping that didn't belong to the engines. It was late November 1943, the convoy strung out somewhere south of Iceland, when the sonar operator aboard USS Dempsey leaned closer to his headset and froze. Every few seconds came a pulse, steady but wrong, like a clock slightly out of beat. He scribbled a note and passed it to the watch officer. Possible contact. Bearing 220. Within moments, the crew felt the familiar shudder of the ship changing course. Men hurried to stations, coffee cups left half full on the mess tables. They had been drilled for this moment, but drills never matched the sound of the real thing. U-boats were learning too. The Germans had shifted to night surface attacks, using radar detectors to spot escorts before the escorts saw them. For the Americans, that meant the old rule, hold the line, stay between wolves and herd, was collapsing. Now every night was an ambush waiting to happen. The new sonar, more sensitive than before, became both salvation and torment. It pinged, painted a trace, lost it, found it again. Operators grew superstitious. A good run meant tapping the console twice. A bad run meant silence until the next contact. By Christmas, Dempsey had already endured 3 near misses. Depth charges boomed, the ship trembled, and black water geysers reached higher than the mast. When nothing came to the surface, doubt crept in. Had they destroyed the target or frightened it off? Commanders called this the gray result, and it haunted the men more than failure. Every false contact wasted fuel, ammunition, and sleep. In a sea where days blurred into metallic dawns and slate midnights, uncertainty was the only constant. Training adjusted to meet it. Sonar crews learned to map the ocean's invisible architecture, temperature layers, salinity bands, currents that bent sound like glass. In classroom diagrams, it looked simple. A line descending from ship to submarine. In practice, it was chaos. A school of fish could mimic a periscope. A thermal shift could hide an entire vessel. Yet experience sharpened ears faster than instruments. Veteran operators could tell the difference between a whale and a U-boat by tone alone. The low, hollow return of a hull was unmistakable once heard, like memory etched into bone. Convoy battles became cat-and-mouse performances measured in seconds. A U-boat fired, dove, and vanished. Escorts triangulated, dropped charges, then circled to listen. Somewhere below, men were listening back. The ocean itself turned into a chessboard of echo and counter-echo. In 10 minutes, That decision will matter, a lieutenant might mutter as he adjusted bearing, knowing the difference between pursuit and panic was the width of a compass line. In early 1944, a convoy designated ON-224 proved how fragile victory could be. 20 merchantmen under escort by 4 destroyer escorts met a wolf pack west of Ireland. For 2 nights, torpedoes struck from every angle. Flames rose, then died in fog. But the escorts adapted in real time, shifting formation, using radar to detect surfaced subs, and coordinating with distant aircraft. When dawn came, 5 U-boats were confirmed lost. The escorts had taken hits, but held the convoy intact. For the first time, commanders began to believe the tide was turning. Still, triumph carried exhaustion. After action, the men walked the decks coated in salt and diesel soot, faces lined by windburn. Letters home spoke less of glory than of monotony, constant watch, cold meals, sleeplessness. Yet beneath fatigue grew a quiet confidence. The escorts had learned the enemy's habits, where they reloaded, how they surfaced, when they risked a shot. Knowledge replaced fear. Every new contact became a test of nerve. Fire too early and waste the pattern. Wait too long and die. Each ping from the sonar dome was a question, each explosion an answer. The destroyer escorts were learning the U-boat's language, syllable by syllable. Soon, that fluency would make them predators in their own right. A convoy in motion was less a fleet and more a living equation. Each ship depended on the others for rhythm, speed, distance, bearing, all bound by an unspoken promise that none would stray. From the bridge of a destroyer escort, the pattern looked deceptively calm. Rows of merchantmen stretching across the gray sea, each following a compass heading rather than a visible path. But beneath that order, tension hummed. Every screw turn, every radio check, every radar sweep had to align, or the wolves would find the gap. For the escorts, procedure was the weapon. Dawn began with coded weather reports and an inspection of the sonar dome, the ship's single eye beneath the hull. It had to be free of ice and barnacles, for a single bubble could cripple detection. Breakfast came in steel trays balanced on rolling tables, the smell of coffee cutting through oil and salt. Then drills, always drills. The men moved as one, signalman at his lamp, helmsman at his wheel, sonar operator whispering bearings into a throat mic. They had trained until movement became reflex, because in the Atlantic, hesitation killed. Depth charges were their oldest tools, but by 1944, a new system called the Hedgehog was transforming escort tactics. Instead of dropping explosives behind the ship, Hedgehog fired a cluster of 24 small bombs ahead of the bow, each one armed to explode only on contact. That single change, forward fire and contact-only detonation, rewrote anti-submarine warfare. Now an escort could attack without losing sonar contact. The moment a sonar trace sharpened, the crew swung into sequence. Bearing steady. Range 1200. Fire 1. The ship shuddered as compressed air launched the pattern. The men listened. If they heard nothing, the U-boat had escaped. If they heard a muffled, deep concussion, it meant victory measured in silence. The procedure was clinical, but the atmosphere wasn't. Each launch carried suspense, like flipping a coin between life and loss. Sonar men developed rituals, lucky pencils, notes taped above their screens, charms made from shrapnel of spent casings. Some ships even named their Hedgehog projectors. Old Faithful, Mary, Lucky 24. It was humor as defense mechanism, a way to humanize the machinery of war. Communication between escorts formed the backbone of convoy defense. Shortwave radio linked them, but brevity codes kept transmissions to a few clipped syllables. Fox 5 meant subcontact. Able 1 meant attack run. Once a report went out, nearby escorts adjusted their arcs automatically, closing a circle around the suspect area. It was choreography rehearsed 100 times, yet every performance was improvised. The ocean, after all, had no stage marks. Sometimes the rhythm itself became a form of protection. The constant hum of propellers and synchronized zigzag patterns created interference that confused U-boat sonar. The Germans called these groups iron herds, and their frustration was evident in captured logs. One commander wrote that attacking a convoy guarded by destroyer escorts was like fighting smoke with a knife. Every successful defense added to the mythology of the small ships, their reputation spreading faster than their wake. Amid this machinery of vigilance, humanity persisted. Mail arrived only when the convoys reached port, so most letters began weeks after the events they described. Crews took solace in routine. Daily muster on deck, small repairs, brief moments of sunlight on the forecastle. The ship's cook became an unlikely morale officer. His coffee pot was the heart of the vessel. It was said that a man could judge his ship's spirit by how steady the coffee line stayed in a storm. Even the act of dropping depth charges followed choreography. The racks held rows of cylindrical bombs, each about 300 pounds, painted gray-green. The men worked in teams: fuse, roll, release. A misstep could mean disaster, yet they performed it as naturally as breathing. When a submarine dove too deep for hedgehog, the escorts returned to these old patterns, raining steel cylinders into the depths at set intervals. The detonations echoed back through the hull, dull and heavy, as though the sea itself were striking back. As months passed, the destroyer escorts refined their dance to near perfection. Convoy losses shrank. U-boats that once prowled with impunity found themselves hunted by invisible sound. What began as defensive escorting evolved into active pursuit. The ships no longer merely protected, they sought. Somewhere in that shift lay the soul of the steel wolves. They had learned to move like the predators they faced, silent, patient, disciplined. The convoy was no longer prey, it was bait. And the destroyer escorts, once considered expendable, had become the fleet's sharpened senses. In 10 minutes, one of those senses would become a symbol. It began with a coffee mug. It wasn't regulation issue, just a chipped ceramic cup with the name Bill scratched into its base by a pocket knife. It belonged to the sonar operator aboard the USS Dempsey, a cannon-class destroyer escort working the mid-Atlantic routes in early 1944. The mug had survived storms, drills, and one near collision. It sat beside the sonar console, half full of coffee gone cold, catching the glow of red instrument light. When the sea grew rough, it slid a few inches but never tipped. No one knew why that mattered, but it did. On ships where everything shifted, something steady, anything steady, became a promise that not all motion meant danger. That mug captured what destroyer escorts had become: balance amid chaos. By that spring, the men were no longer simply enduring the Atlantic. They were mastering it. Every lesson written in salt and static had reshaped how they fought. The sonar pings that once sounded alien now felt like a second heartbeat. The crews trusted the rhythm. Ping, echo, adjust bearing, fire. What began as panic had matured into intuition. They didn't just react to U-boats anymore, they predicted them. The Dempsey's captain, a former merchant sailor, described the ship as half instinct, half machine. His bridge officers understood. The escorts had become extensions of the men inside them, steel responding to pulse, procedure responding to emotion. A flicker on a radar screen could raise heart rates faster than gunfire. But alongside fear came a new calm. Experience had replaced the raw edge of survival with methodical resolve. In the sonar room, operators worked in near darkness, their faces pale against the glow. Outside, waves crashed against the hull. But within that cramped chamber, time moved differently. Minutes stretched. Sound became sight. They could almost see the ocean's structure in their minds, the layers of cold and warmth, the paths submarines might take. When the mug trembled from vibration, it was a reminder. Something down there was moving too. By mid-1944, destroyer escorts were serving as the Navy's nervous system across the Atlantic. Each carried innovations born from necessity: gyro-stabilized compasses, automatic depth recorders, and improved radar that could track a periscope at miles of distance. The ships spoke to one another in bursts of Morse code, forming a web of awareness that covered thousands of miles of open ocean. What had once been isolated points of defense had evolved into a coordinated network. The men themselves adapted as profoundly as their tools. Sleep became optional. Vigilance became habit. They learned to distinguish the pitch of their own propellers from another's, to read wind by taste, to sense a submarine's position before instruments confirmed it. When the first ice crystals formed on their decks each winter, they didn't curse the cold. They measured it, knowing temperature affected sonar range. Science and instinct had fused. Yet it was in small gestures: the mug, the penciled log entries, the way a sailor could pour coffee while the ship rolled 40 degrees, that the transformation was most visible. These were no longer green crews running rehearsed procedures. They were craftsmen of survival, improvisers of technology, and quiet engineers of a new kind of warfare. When a storm hit one March night and smashed half the bridge windows, the Derby's crew lashed themselves to the rails, refusing to turn back. Their orders were to escort the convoy until relief arrived. For 2 days, they steamed through waves taller than the mast. The mug never broke. When the weather cleared, they found the convoy still intact. The captain laughed for the first time in weeks, lifted the mug, and toasted the sea itself. That chipped cup, like the men who guarded it, was proof that durability wasn't measured in size or glamour. It was measured in persistence, the will to hold course when everything else moved. And from that persistence came something greater than survival: belief. The destroyer escorts had found their rhythm, their identity, and their strange new name. They were the steel wolves now, and the Atlantic was starting to fear them. By the spring of 1944, the Atlantic had become a theater of pursuit rather than protection. Destroyer escorts were no longer tethered to the slow crawl of merchant convoys. They now moved with purpose, forming what the Navy called hunter-killer groups, tight circles of aggression built around small escort carriers that launched aircraft ahead of the formation. The carriers carried eyes. The destroyer escorts carried teeth. Together, they hunted the hunters. Among these new predators was the USS England, a Buckley-class destroyer escort named for a young ensign killed at Pearl Harbor. At just over 300 feet long, it looked ordinary, its guns modest, its silhouette plain, but its crew was sharp, its sonar flawless, and its hedgehog system tuned to perfection. In May 1944, operating in the South Pacific near the Solomons, England would set a record that became legend: 6 U-boats in 12 days. The first contact came on May 18th. Sonar picked up a faint trace at 2,000 yards, moving erratically. The captain ordered a hedgehog attack. 24 bombs arced forward, disappearing into foam. 20 seconds of silence followed, then a deep, blunt explosion. Oil rose to the surface, proof unmistakable. The crew cheered, but there was no pause. New bearings, new signals, another contact. Within hours, a second submarine went down. For days, England moved like an extension of the ocean's pulse. Each engagement was clinical. Detect, approach, fire, confirm. The men slept in shifts of 2 hours, ate standing up, lived on adrenaline and precision. Their sonar team, barely in their 20s, could interpret a faint blip faster than most officers could blink. They listened not only for echoes, but for absences, the subtle moments when sound bent away, hinting at a submerged hull turning for escape. Each success tightened the loop of confidence, until instinct felt like prophecy. When the 6th U-boat vanished beneath the waves, England's captain sent a simple radio message to command: 6 for 6. The reply came back brief, almost reverent. Well done. Even then, the crew didn't boast. They cleaned the sonar room, logged the readings, and prepared for the next patrol. Efficiency was its own reward. The Navy studied England's actions with awe. Her victories weren't accidents. They were the culmination of everything the destroyer escort concept promised. Cheap, fast-built vessels manned by well-trained crews who turned technology into instinct. The little ships, once dismissed as expendable, had become indispensable. Every escort captain now carried England's patrol reports like sacred text, studying timing, angles, and the exact cadence of her attack runs. Doctrine evolved overnight. The Germans noticed too. Surviving U-boat commanders began calling destroyer escorts Die kleinen Teufel, the little devils. They adapted by diving deeper, using acoustic decoys, or hiding beneath thermoclines where sonar blurred. But even these tactics faltered. The Allies had cracked the Enigma code months earlier, and now destroyer escorts often sailed with foreknowledge. Coordinates, estimated positions, last transmissions. Intelligence and sonar formed a partnership of lethal precision. In the Atlantic, hunter-killer groups like Task Group 22. 3 roamed the sea lanes. Aircraft from escort carriers spotted submarine wakes. Destroyer escorts closed in for the kill. It was coordinated, relentless, and strangely impersonal. A duel fought through machinery and mathematics. Yet, to the men inside those small steel hulls, every contact still carried heartbeat tension. Sonar pings were more than sound. They were the echo of invisible eyes staring back. The success came at a price. The tempo of operations left no room for error. Crews fought exhaustion as fiercely as the enemy. Some ships spent over 100 consecutive days at sea. Salt corroded metal. Men's hands split open from cold and fuel residue. And still they kept watch, eyes fixed on instruments glowing faint green in the dark. War at sea had become a test of endurance, and the destroyer escorts were winning it not by force, but by precision repeated until it felt like prayer. By late 1944, statistics told a quiet story. Merchant shipping losses were down by nearly 90% compared to the worst years of the war. Convoys reached Britain almost unscathed. The balance of fear had shifted. The Atlantic, once a graveyard, was now a corridor of supply-feeding armies that would soon liberate Europe. And at its heart stood the humble destroyer escort, fast enough to hunt, tough enough to survive, cheap enough to multiply. For the men aboard, triumph didn't feel like celebration. It felt like silence. Long hours without contacts, calm seas, sleep uninterrupted by alarms. They had fought the longest battle of the war and were finally winning it. But the ocean has a long memory, and in 10 minutes, that calm would be tested one last time. By January 1945, winter reclaimed the Atlantic. The war in Europe was nearly over, but the ocean refused to acknowledge it. The last U-boat offensive, codenamed Operation Paukenschlag, Torntu, sent dozens of submarines toward the shipping lanes between Newfoundland and the British Isles. Their mission was desperation itself, to prove that Germany still possessed a weapon that could strike at will. What they met instead was a wall of steel and sound. Destroyer escorts no longer waited for distress calls. They patrolled in sweeping arcs, radar and sonar overlapping like concentric rings. The ocean floor had become mapped territory. The hunters' hiding places were known. Each contact now began the same way. A faint echo, a confirmation, a calm voice over the intercom. Bearing steady. What followed was not frenzy, but choreography. Depth charges rolled from rails at precise intervals, hedgehogs fired in measured bursts, and the men counted seconds with mechanical precision. On the night of February 9th, the USS Foley and her group caught a U-boat surfacing for air west of Ireland. Searchlights cut through sleet. Tracer fire laced the dark. The submarine crash-dived, leaving a white spiral of foam. The escorts surrounded the spot, dropping patterns until the sea itself boiled. When oil spread across the waves, no cheer went up. The crew simply marked a line through a coordinate on the chart and moved to the next patrol. Victory had become a routine, proof that procedure, not passion, had conquered the Atlantic. What made these moments remarkable was their restraint. No speeches, no headlines. The men understood that winning quietly was the purest form of control. They called it the clean kill. No debris, no noise, just absence. In a war obsessed with spectacle, the destroyer Escorts succeeded by erasing evidence of battle. Even so, danger persisted. A week later, a convoy designated HX-332 met one of the last wolf packs still operational. The sea was calm for once, the moon high. Sonar operators aboard USS Atherton picked up a slow-moving contact shadowing the convoy. It was U-853, one of the few submarines equipped with acoustic torpedoes. For hours it stayed just beyond reach, matching the convoy's pace. Then, without warning, a torpedo struck a Liberty ship near the center column. The explosion shattered the calm. Alarms blared across the formation. But this time, there was no confusion. The escorts pivoted inward, forming a tightening spiral. Atherton fired hedgehog after hedgehog, every pattern slightly closer. The 11th salvo found its mark. 2 muffled detonations rolled through the hull, followed by a third that shook the deck. Moments later, wreckage surfaced. Pieces of wood, fragments of rubber, a faint smell of oil. The Atlantic exhaled. U-853's destruction marked more than another kill. It symbolized an ending. The wolf packs that had once terrorized the sea were gone, their tactics obsolete. The Atlantic, for the first time in 6 years, belonged to those who could listen better, not shout louder. The escorts had turned patience into power. In ports from Boston to Belfast, sailors began to sense the war's closing weight. Convoys grew smaller. Messages from London spoke of final offensives, of peace near at hand. The ships that had lived on constant vigilance now faced silence that felt almost foreign. Men stood watch out of habit, scanning horizons that no longer hid threats. The rhythm of ping and echo faded until even the sonar room seemed too quiet. Yet the discipline remained. They kept their charts updated, their engines tuned, their mugs filled halfway. The war might end tomorrow, but procedure would not. That was the destroyer Escort's creed. Method above emotion, function above fame. The ocean, unpredictable and merciless, had been mastered through repetition, and that mastery had saved nations. By the time Germany surrendered in May, the escorts had escorted thousands of ships and lost relatively few of their own. Historians would later say the Atlantic turned not because of a single battle, but because ordinary men aboard small ships refused to lose their rhythm. They did their work in the dark, in the cold, and in the silence between sonar pings. And when the last echo faded, they simply logged the time and course and carried on. When the orders finally came to return home, the destroyer escorts looked the same as they had at the beginning. Gray paint, chipped rails, names barely legible under salt. But inside, everything had changed. The crews, who had once measured time by pings and alarms, now stood at the rails watching a quiet ocean. The same sea that had hidden their enemies now reflected sunlight like glass. For the first time in years, it seemed harmless. The USS Derby made her last crossing in early May 1945. The convoy carried no tanks or shells this time, only grain and medical supplies. The air was warmer and even the gulls seemed closer to shore. Men lined the decks in silence as the ship passed the coordinates where they had once dropped depth charges. Beneath those waters lay the remnants of the war, steel, oil, and the ghosts of ships that never came home. No one spoke, but everyone looked. The ocean kept its secrets. That was enough. In port, the welcome was subdued. Bands played, flags waved, but the destroyer escorts were too small for parades. They tied up alongside piers while larger ships took the headlines. Yet officers from every fleet came to see them, to trace the dented plates, to study the welded seams that had survived storms and shock waves. They found beauty not in symmetry, but in endurance. Each scratch was a story of procedure done right. Some escorts were decommissioned within months, their usefulness already replaced by peacetime priorities. Others lingered, repurposed for training or weather patrols. A few crossed into new wars under new flags, still carrying the hum of their first engines. The men who had served aboard them dispersed across the country. Many never spoke of their missions. They took jobs in factories, on farms, behind desks, but in quiet moments. The hiss of a coffee kettle, the sound of rain on a roof. They heard the ocean again, steady and unending. Historians would later call the Battle of the Atlantic a victory of production, code-breaking, and air power. But the men who had lived it knew the truth was smaller and harder. It was a victory of attention. The destroyer escorts had turned listening into defense, routine into survival. Their success was not the roar of guns, but the patience to hear an echo in the dark and believe it meant something. In museums today, a few artifacts remain. A sonar dome dulled by decades of corrosion, a hedgehog bomb resting harmlessly behind glass, a crew roster signed in pencil. Visitors walk past them quickly, drawn to the grander exhibits. But those who stop, who read the small print, find themselves facing the essence of the Atlantic War. The idea that persistence, repeated 1,000 times without glory, can change the course of history. The legacy of the destroyer escorts outlived the ocean battles they fought. Their design influenced generations of naval ships, frigates, corvettes, and patrol vessels that still bear traces of their simplicity. Their doctrine shaped how the Navy thought about teamwork and technology, about the balance between man and machine. They proved that ingenuity wasn't measured in tonnage, but in adaptation. That the smallest ship, in the right hands, could command the largest sea. One evening, decades later, a retired sonar operator from the Derby visited a memorial along the Maine coast. The sea was calm again, the horizon pale gold. He carried with him a small object wrapped in cloth. A mug, chipped and faded, the name Bill still etched at its base. He set it on the granite ledge beside the names of ships long gone and listened. Waves lapped against the rocks with a rhythm faintly familiar. Ping, echo, pause. He smiled, certain the ocean still remembered. Far offshore, fishing boats moved across the same waters once haunted by submarines. Their engines beat the same low tempo as the escorts that had guarded them generations before. The Atlantic had returned to commerce, to silence, to peace. But if you listened closely, beneath the wind, you could almost hear it. The disciplined hum of 100 small engines holding formation, invisible but eternal. The steel wolves had faded into history, but their story remained carved into the sound of the sea itself. They proved that courage could be methodical, that heroism could whisper instead of shout, and that victory could come not from fury, but from focus. The calm had returned, but this time it was theirs.